The year was 1972, and the river cut through the low country like a silver scar, calm on the surface but hiding its own restless currents beneath. Along one of its remote bends, in a place where the cornfields gave way to marsh and sycamore, a small group of believers had built a settlement that called itself a sanctuary. It was spoken of in the neighboring town with a mixture of pity and unease, for no one quite understood what compelled families to abandon farms, shops, and kin to live in cabins raised hurriedly from timber and prayer. What is remembered, what records testify and survivors later whispered, was that this commune carried an order of silence more absolute than any oath. They ate without speaking. They lived under a code that demanded their words be buried as deeply as their dead. To speak of this place is to speak of extremes. On the surface, order, peace, and discipline. A people who sought to strip away the noise of the modern world and live closer to God, but beneath, an atmosphere where silence was not a gift but a cage, where the absence of words became a tool of control. The meals, so often described as sacred, became rituals of dread, and the burials that followed were hidden from the day's light, carried out in shadows along the riverbank. It is said the moon bore witness to more truth than the law ever did. Our concern here is not to sensationalize but to illuminate. What happened at the River Commune is a part of the historical record, though pieced together from scraps, journals left behind, scattered testimonies, sealed reports reluctantly opened decades later. These are fragments of lives once lived in silence, arranged now so that they may be heard. But before we continue, a note of care. Some accounts speak of neglect, hunger, and death, matters that cannot be softened without diminishing the people who endured them. We proceed with empathy, naming cruelty not for spectacle but for remembrance. If this is your first time with us, I would ask, where are you listening from? Across towns and countries, across generations, the river's story ripples outward, carried by voices that refuse to be quieted. To join in hearing this tale is, in a small way, to push back against the silence that was once imposed. At its heart, this story begins with a paradox. The River Commune was meant to be a haven from the corruption of modern life, a place of purity, yet purity was enforced in ways that left no room for mercy. To eat was to eat under watchful eyes, each sound weighed as sin. To mourn was to mourn quietly, because even grief was ordered and policed. And when those lost were laid into the ground, it was not beneath the open sun of community, but under the cover of night, with lanterns dimmed and shovels muffled. The claim that follows is difficult, almost impossible, to believe, that in a decade marked by progress and protest, by movements for rights and recognition, there existed here in the Midwest an enclave where dozens lived under a silence so profound that even their suffering went unheard. But the evidence, fragmentary though it is, points to its truth. And so we open this case not as entertainment but as testimony, for the quiet left behind still demands to be broken. Before we continue into the darker details, there is something I must ask of you directly. Where are you listening from tonight? That small act of grounding yourself in a place, of letting us know the landscape around you, is part of how this community of listeners resist the forgetting that silence once enforced. The people in this story were bound by isolation, their voices denied, their stories buried. You, by contrast, are free to speak, free to place your presence on the record. That contrast matters. It transforms this tale from a solitary recounting into a shared act of remembrance. We will be handling the details with care, because the account involves children, hunger, and deaths that were never fully acknowledged by the institutions meant to protect. It would be irresponsible to press forward without naming the weight of what lies ahead. Some of what follows will be painful to hear, not for shock, but for the way it reveals how cruelty can be disguised as discipline and how suffering can be erased by bureaucracy. Transparency is essential. What you hear is pieced together from contemporary reports, sealed documents later unclassified, and testimony from survivors who carried these memories for decades. Each fragment carries bias, but together they form a pattern too coherent to dismiss. The River Commune itself framed silence as virtue, but the silence it created functioned as control. In contrast to the noisy, bustling towns of the Midwest in the early 1970s, cafes crowded with talk, radio filling kitchens, local papers debating everything. From Nixon to Vietnam, the commune lived as if sealed away in a different century. The absence of speech at meals was explained to outsiders as reverence, a spiritual discipline meant to quiet the mind and honor God's gifts. But for those inside, it became something else, a weight that pressed down with every spoonful, every glance, every refusal to allow questions or protests to be voiced. This is why we invite you not only to listen but to respond. The townsfolk who lived nearby had suspicions but lacked evidence, and when they raised concerns, they were often dismissed as meddling. By adding your own voice to the story, by telling us where you stand, literally and figuratively, you resist. The very erasure that once kept the victims hidden, silence was their prison. Participation is our act of breaking it. So as we enter the history of this river settlement, hold this contrast in mind. Community versus isolation, voice versus suppression. The people who followed Eli Harn into those cabins on the floodplain believed they were stepping into a family, bound by faith. In truth, they were entering a system that used silence as shackles. Their voices were buried while their bodies still lived. Now, as we reconstruct their story, we allow them to be heard again, not as artifacts of shame, but as reminders of what silence, when weaponized, can destroy. The land where the River Commune took root was neither welcoming nor fertile, yet to its followers it was imagined as a promised ground, a low stretch of the Midwest floodplain, 2 miles from the nearest paved road. It offered both seclusion and peril. Each spring the river swelled, licking at the foundations of the cabins. Each winter the winds tore across fields that bore little more than stunted corn. To outsiders it looked like hardship. To those who came there it was proof of devotion. They believed suffering was a sign of purity, that turning one's back on the conveniences of town life, running water, reliable stores, the noise of radios, was a cleansing act. What they gained in silence and distance, however, they lost in connection, and that isolation soon became the very soil in which control was planted. The commune grew in fragments, each cabin hammered together by rough lumber scavenged from abandoned barns. Families lived shoulder to shoulder, yet the design of the settlement carried a subtle order. At the center was a crude meeting hall, built larger than any other structure, where Eli Harn delivered his teachings. Around it, in concentric rings, lay the dwellings of the most loyal, then the hesitant, then those who had joined last and least. Even in the geography of the place, there was hierarchy. Closeness to the hall mirrored closeness to the leader. That contrast between proclaimed equality and visible stratification was the first sign that ideals of community masked a system of quiet power. Beyond the cabins, the landscape bore both beauty and menace. The river itself was broad and deceptively calm, carrying logs and debris with an indifferent current. Children were warned not to play near it. Yet the water was their only source of cleansing and, in lean times, their only pantry. Fish were pulled from it when the crops failed, though there are records of spoilage, of sickness spreading through the camp after poorly preserved catches were consumed. The fields to the west had once been farmed by local families, but the commune's inexperienced hands left them fallow, weeds rising where grain had once stood. Hunger became not just a physical reality but a weapon, its slow progression shaping obedience. The nearby town regarded the commune with a wary mix of scorn and sympathy. Farmers shook their heads at the sight of oxen-driven plows in an age of tractors. Merchants spoke of once regular customers who now came rarely, paying in small coins or barter. Church leaders muttered about blasphemy, calling the river group heretics, though some younger townsfolk admitted to a flicker of envy at the thought of leaving behind the world's noise. That tension between attraction and repulsion framed the commune's existence in the public imagination. At once a curiosity, a warning, and a temptation. Inside the settlement, the silence was cultivated most starkly at meals. Long wooden tables were lined with benches, and each family brought what they could spare: root vegetables, scraps of salted pork, cornbread made dense from cheap flour. Yet once the food was set down, a stillness fell that was not reverent but oppressive. No prayers were spoken aloud. No words of thanks were permitted. Eli Harn had declared that eating was sacred, that the body consumed best when the soul was quiet. The punishment for speaking, recorded in later testimonies, ranged from exclusion at the next meal to forced fasting for days. Contrast again revealed itself. A community gathered to share sustenance, but stripped of the warmth of conversation. Their union became cold and transactional. There are photographs, grainy and poorly preserved, showing the settlement from across the river. Smoke rises from chimneys. Figures move indistinctly between cabins. To an unknowing eye, it could resemble any rural farmstead of the 1970s, yet The absence of sound in those images, the silence you imagine, when you look, conveys more truth than any caption. In that stillness was the commune's promise of purity and its hidden seed of ruin. What was built to be a sanctuary was, in practice, a landscape of control, where every acre, every cabin, every gesture was bound by the expectation of quiet submission. Eli Harn was not born a prophet, though by the time he gathered his flock along the river, he carried himself with the gravity of one who believed he had been chosen. His beginnings were unremarkable. The son of a coal miner in western Kentucky, briefly enrolled in seminary before leaving under circumstances the records describe only as disciplinary. He drifted for years through revival tents and rented church halls, speaking with an eloquence that earned him small followings but never permanence. Each time the pattern repeated: gather a handful of believers, stir them with promises of renewal, then lose them when contradictions or demands grew too heavy. By 1971, he had reinvented himself once more, this time as a man who claimed that true holiness could only be found in silence, a doctrine he said was revealed to him during a fast on the banks of the very river where he would later settle. To his followers, Harn radiated certainty. He spoke with a cadence that carried no hesitation, often quoting fragments of scripture, though rarely in full. His eyes, survivors later recalled, seemed always fixed slightly above the heads of those he addressed, as if listening to an unseen interlocutor. Yet behind this performance of revelation lay an unmistakable hunger for power. In his teaching, silence was not only virtue but obedience, a sign that the tongue, and thus the will, had been subdued. He told his commune that speech was the root of corruption. Through words came lies, gossip, rebellion, and temptation. To refuse to speak at meals, to surrender the daily chatter of family life, was in his framing a proof of purity. The contrast could not be starker. What to the outside world was natural expression, to Harn became sin. What others would call repression, he named holiness. His rules extended beyond the table. Children were corrected if they hummed or sang outside of sanctioned hymns. Women were discouraged from asking questions during sermons, for the Spirit works in silence. Men who murmured complaints about food or work were made to spend nights outside the cabins, fasting and praying until they returned compliant. Through these practices, Harn crafted a culture where silence was not absence but instrument. It was the air everyone breathed, the weight under which they bent. Charisma alone would not have bound the commune so tightly if not for the disillusionment of the era. Many who joined were families, unsettled by the turbulence of the early 1970s, the war overseas, protests at home, an economy shifting beneath their feet. To them, Harn's insistence on discipline, quiet, and separation from the noise of Babylon offered a strange kind of relief. The world was chaotic. The commune was orderly. The world was profane. The commune was sacred. That contrast between the chaos outside and the constructed calm inside lent credibility to his leadership, even as the rules grew harsher. In photographs, Harn appears plain, a tall man with thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and clothes more suited to a farmer than a preacher. But his image in memory is less ordinary. Survivors describe his silences as more commanding than his sermons. He would pause, often mid-thought, and let the quiet extend until those around him squirmed. Then he would continue, as if proving that even discomfort was a lesson. That manipulation of silence, what he named as virtue but wielded as control, became his signature, the force by which he molded the commune into obedience. Under his rule, silence was both a shield and a weapon. It shielded the commune from outside scrutiny, for few spoke of what happened there. It weaponized obedience, for to break silence was to break faith. And so, in a settlement meant to be a sanctuary, every word unspoken tightened the grip of one man's authority, until even the sound of chewing at a communal table became a reminder that the cost of breaking quiet was punishment, and the cost of defiance could be far worse. The first tragedy to draw whispers beyond the cabins came in the autumn of 1972, when the corn harvest had failed and meals at the long tables grew thin. Among the families seated in silence was the child of a young couple, a boy no more than 7. His name has been lost to records, appearing only once in a diary fragment as the small one who would not eat, but his absence lingers across every surviving account. At the meals where no voices were allowed, his refusal to swallow became a visible rupture. He pushed bread away, let broth grow cold. His parents, unable to coax him without speaking, sat paralyzed, aware that every eye at the table was upon them. The discipline of silence, which Eli Harn proclaimed as holy, had turned a child's hunger strike into a public act of defiance. Days stretched on, and the boy's condition worsened. Witnesses later told investigators that he grew too weak to stand, that his ribs showed through his shirt. Some believed he resisted out of instinct, a child rebelling against rules he could not comprehend. Others whispered that he had once been punished for speaking at the table and never recovered from the shame. Whatever the reason, his refusal to eat collided with the leader's doctrine. To disrupt the ritual of silent meals was to disrupt the commune's purity. Harn ordered the boy kept apart, until he accepted food in stillness. No words of comfort were permitted. No prayers spoken aloud. The silence that was supposed to sanctify the table became a coffin around a still living child. After his death, official records are mute. There was no death certificate filed in town, no notice in the local paper. All that remains are fragments. A line in the midwife's journal noting one child gone to rest. A passing mention in an oral history of a boy buried too soon. Even the place of his grave is uncertain. Some say it was near the tree line, hidden from view. Others insist it was by the river itself, where soil was easier to break. But always it was at night, under cover of darkness, with lanterns low and shovels dull. This first loss might have sounded alarms in another time, in another place. A death of a child in such conditions could have drawn doctors, sheriffs, reporters. Yet in the insularity of the commune, silence once again ruled. Families grieved without words, burying both their sorrow and their dead. The townsfolk heard rumors, but nothing that could be proven. To those outside, it seemed a private tragedy. To those within, it became a lesson. Children learned what happened when one resisted. Parents understood what was demanded of obedience. The contrast was cruel. A boy's natural instinct to cry out, to demand comfort, was met with an environment where sound itself was forbidden. His silence was enforced in life, and in death it was absolute. From that moment forward, the atmosphere of the commune shifted. What had been framed as discipline now carried an undercurrent of fear. The meals continued, the silence continued, but now it bore the weight of absence. An empty space at the table, a grave dug in darkness, and a rule strengthened by loss. The tragedy of the boy's death was not only that he was starved in body, but that his refusal to conform was interpreted as sin. His silence in death made to reinforce the very law that had undone him. Among the few documents that survived the commune's collapse, none are as revealing as the diary of a midwife named Ruth Elkins. She had entered the settlement in 1971 with her husband, drawn by the promise of spiritual purity, and soon found herself the only one with even modest training in childbirth and care. What she recorded in her small, leather-bound book, later retrieved by relatives after the commune was abandoned, stands as one of the clearest windows into daily life. The entries are uneven, at times no more than a line or two, but they bear witness to suffering that official records ignored. In her words, the contradictions of the settlement come into sharp relief. She was a woman sworn to nurture, yet her pen confessed complicity in silence. One entry, dated September 18, 1972, is blunt. One child gone to rest, too weak and none could persuade him. The brevity is chilling, as though even her private thoughts bowed to the rules of economy and silence. Yet in the margins she scratched darker notes. They made me cover him before dawn. Earth damp, lantern low. No hymn. That contrast, the clinical brevity of her daily record, against the whispered agony at the margins, captures the divide between outward obedience and inner torment. Her diary also reveals how hunger spread through the community. She writes of women laboring while underfed, of infants with sunken eyes, of her own doubts masked beneath dutiful phrases. I asked Eli if broth might be permitted, she confesses in one entry, but he said the tongue sins when it seeks exceptions. So I said no more. Here the artifact shows silence, not only as a communal ritual but as a personal burden, where even the instinct to plead for nourishment was stifled by fear of rebuke. There is a recurring image across her entries, the graves. She notes them not in detail but with repetition, as though counting silently. Another by the elm, Another by the river, always at night. The words are almost a code. Careful not to name too much, yet they preserve a pattern the commune's leader sought to hide. Her notations transform private grief into evidence. They are, in effect, proof that what was whispered in town, the rumors of secret burials, was rooted in fact. When investigators finally accessed her diary years later, it became a rare artifact of corroboration. Many testimonies by survivors were discredited or dismissed as memory warped by trauma, but the midwife's entries carried dates, times, and the steady hand of contemporaneity. Even where her language was sparse, the weight of implication was unmistakable. In her words, we glimpse the collision of two forces: the natural impulse of a caregiver to preserve life, and the imposed silence of a system that demanded obedience over compassion. What makes the diary so haunting is not only what it says, but what it withholds. Pages are missing, torn out cleanly, perhaps by her own hand or another's. At least 2 months are unaccounted for, gaps that fall during the harshest winter the commune endured. Whether those absences conceal more deaths or simply her fear of writing, we cannot know. Yet even the missing pages function as testimony, silence preserved in paper form, echoing the enforced quiet of the community itself. The artifact stands today in an archive, its cover worn, its ink faded, but its presence undeniable. It is the kind of proof that defies erasure, a voice that endured despite efforts to bury it. Through Ruth Elkins's hand, we are reminded that silence was never absolute. Even within the commune, there were those who resisted in the only way they could, by recording what others were forbidden to speak. The second tragedy unfolded with a swiftness that unsettled even those who had learned to accept suffering as part of their faith. It centered on a woman named Miriam Hale, a mother in her early 30s who had joined the commune with her husband and young daughter. By all accounts, Miriam had been dutiful in the rituals, keeping her head bowed at meals and her voice hushed when silence was demanded. Yet beneath her compliance there lingered a current of doubt. Neighbors remembered her as restless, one of the few women who sometimes lingered by the river with her child, humming softly when she thought no one was near. For a time her small acts went unnoticed, but hunger and grief have a way of magnifying discontent. After the death of the young boy earlier that autumn, Miriam's resolve began to fracture. The day of her disappearance began with rumors that she had questioned the fairness of fasting for children, speaking softly enough that only those near her table could hear. By nightfall she was gone, taking her daughter with her. Survivors later recalled whispers in the cabins that she intended to cross the river to seek help from relatives in the town nearby. Her absence was discovered at the evening gathering, and Eli Harn's reaction was described as chilling in its restraint. He did not rage. He simply said, "The river receives the disobedient." 2 days later, her body was found downstream, tangled among reeds, her dress heavy with silt. The sheriff's report, filed with remarkable brevity, listed the cause as accidental drowning. The daughter, however, was not recovered. Some claimed she was swept further away by the current. Others whispered that she had been taken back into the commune. The truth was never established. In the absence of clarity, silence once again swallowed certainty. The contrast here is stark and unbearable. A mother's desperate bid for freedom colliding with the indifference of both nature and authority. The river, which to outsiders was a place of recreation and baptism, to the commune became an instrument of punishment, real or implied. Miriam's attempt to speak through action, to break silence by flight, was met with a fate that silenced her forever. What lingers in testimony is the unease of those who remained. Children were warned more harshly than ever not to linger by the river. Women grew more subdued, their glances cast downward in a fear sharpened by Miriam's fate. Even men, some of whom had once murmured complaints in private, now understood the cost of disobedience. Whether Miriam's death was accident or consequence, it was used as proof. Those who defied the order of silence would be claimed by the water. Her story reached the town in fragments, carried by gossip and a brief mention in the sheriff's log. Outsiders, hearing only of a drowning, shook their heads and spoke of tragedy. But for those inside the commune, the message was clear. The silence had been deepened, reinforced not only at the table but along the banks of the river. Miriam Hale's final act, an attempt to save her daughter, was erased beneath official indifference, her voice drowned in both water and bureaucracy. The pattern was forming. First a child buried quietly, then a mother carried away by the current. Each incident layering fear upon fear, teaching those who remained that silence was no longer ritual but survival itself. The sheriff's office kept its records on lined paper bound in thick logbooks, each entry no more than a few sentences, signed and dated by hand. These books were meant to be a permanent account of order kept in the county, a ledger of thefts, disputes, and deaths. Yet when it came to the commune by the river, the entries speak more through what they omit than what they reveal. In October of 1972, just days after Miriam Hale's body was pulled from the reeds, there appears a brief notation, female, approx. 30 years, accidental drowning, no foul play suspected, case closed. The words are stripped of all humanity, no mention of her name, no acknowledgement of her child, no recognition of the rumors that spread through town of a desperate escape. In black ink, the silence of the commune was mirrored by the silence of authority. The logbook's language is bureaucratic, almost clinical. It reduces Miriam to female, her suffering to accidental, her story to a closed case. That contrast between the lived terror of a woman who risked everything and the detached ink of officialdom is jarring. Survivors would later testify that they saw deputies near the commune in those days. But none questioned Harn or his followers. None searched for the missing child. To the sheriff, the matter was finished. To the people of the commune, the logbook's dismissal was confirmation that no help would come from outside. Other entries from the same period compound the silence. A neighbor's report of strange lights near the river at night is recorded, then dismissed as unfounded. A notation about concerns raised by townsfolk regarding child health is followed by the phrase, "Insufficient evidence, no further inquiry." These lines, preserved in neat cursive, reveal a pattern of reluctance. The sheriff's office was not ignorant. They were uninterested, unwilling to push against the shield of religious freedom. Harn invoked whenever outsiders asked questions. The artifact of the logbook thus becomes more than a historical record. It is evidence of neglect. Its pages stand as proof not only of deaths but of omissions, of opportunities to intervene that were quietly set aside. The contrast here is one of duty versus indifference. The law was meant to protect the vulnerable, yet its guardians reduced cries for help to routine notations. Where the midwife's diary whispered truths in the margins, the sheriff's book speaks in its stark brevity, its refusal to acknowledge suffering. Later, when the logbook was retrieved from the county archive, its entries on the commune drew sharp criticism. Historians called them evasive. Journalists called them complicit. But at the time they carried authority. In the eyes of the public record, no crime had occurred, no children had died, no mother had been punished for seeking freedom. The logbook closed the cases as neatly as its pages. For the commune, this was more than negligence, it was protection. Harn could point to the sheriff's notes as proof that his settlement was untouched by scandal, that outsiders slandered what the law itself had judged harmless. Thus the artifact becomes a mirror, reflecting the two silences at play, the forced quiet of the commune and the institutional quiet of the state. Together, they ensured that what happened along the river remained buried in obscurity, invisible until years later, when survivors began to speak, and the faded ink of the sheriff's logbook was examined, not as truth but as complicity. The third and most chilling pattern began to surface in the winter of 1973, when the ground grew hard with frost and the night stretched long. Villagers across the river reported seeing faint lantern light flickering along the banks at hours when the commune should have been asleep. At first it was dismissed as farmers hunting or men checking traps, but the frequency grew undeniable. Almost every week, sometimes twice, the glow of firelight drifted between the sycamores, accompanied by the muffled thud of shovels breaking earth. It was said that no words were ever heard, no prayers carried on the night air, only the sounds of digging, of earth being displaced, and the occasional cry of an infant cut short by silence. One farmer, returning late from town, claimed he saw figures moving in procession, carrying something wrapped in a pale cloth toward the riverbank. He swore it was a body, small enough to be a child, and that the group lowered it into the ground without a word. Another witness, a fisherman on the river, recalled how the light seemed to vanish whenever he drew close, as if the commune had learned to extinguish lanterns at the first sign of outsiders. The secrecy itself spoke volumes. If these were ordinary burials, why not mark them in daylight with the rituals of grief? Why always at night with such deliberate concealment? The contrast was brutal. Death, which by tradition unites communities in mourning, here became an act hidden under the cover of darkness, a ritual of erasure rather than remembrance. Inside the commune, survivors later recounted, the burials were not openly discussed. Families were told to trust the silence and accept that the dead had been taken into the soil and purity. Questions about causes, illness, hunger, accident were discouraged, even punished. The children, however, noticed the absences. They counted empty seats at the long tables. They whispered to one another when their parents could not hear, stitching together what the adults would not admit. It was in their hushed games that the pattern first became undeniable. Too many gone. Too quickly. Always after nights when the lanterns burned. Rumors filtered into town, sharpened by imagination but rooted in truth. Stories spread of a graveyard by the river, unmarked and growing. Some claimed they had found disturbed earth, soil that appeared freshly turned, though no markers were placed. Others said the river itself was swallowing the dead, that bodies were consigned to the current instead of the ground. Whatever the reality, fear mingled with fascination, and the commune's reputation shifted from eccentricity to menace. No longer were they simply odd believers who ate in silence. They were keepers of a graveyard, a community whose secrecy masked something darker than prayer. The burials at night became, in effect, the commune's most damning ritual. In daylight, they projected discipline and calm. Men at work, women tending fires, children in orderly lines. At night, they became shadows moving in silence, shovels biting earth, graves closing over unnamed dead. That contrast, the facade of sanctity by day, the concealment of burial by night, was the clearest signal that the commune's laws were no longer only about purity but about control through fear. Each grave dug under lantern light was not only an end but a warning, a message to those who lived. This, too, awaits anyone who resists. By the close of that winter, even the townspeople who once pitied the settlers began to keep their distance. Few dared to cross the river, and those who did found excuses to leave quickly. The riverbank, once a place of fishing and trade, became a line no one wished to cross after dark. The pattern of secret burials had transformed the commune into something more sinister in the public mind, a place where silence fed not holiness but death, and where the river's edge marked the boundary between life in daylight and the graves of night. At this point in the story, when the lantern-lit burials had become a whispered certainty, tension among listeners naturally rises to its peak. It is here, in the pause between revelation and analysis, that I turn to you directly. If you have followed the story this far, if you have felt the weight of silence pressing through these accounts, I ask you to consider something. What is it worth to continue bringing these hidden histories into the open? The very act of listening is resistance against erasure. The very act of remembering ensures that those who were once silenced are not buried again. This is also the moment to break, if only briefly, the heaviness that settles in. If you value stories like these, stories pieced from diaries, logbooks, and testimonies long ignored, I ask that you lend your voice. Subscribe, follow, or simply share where you are listening from. In doing so, you declare that silence will not win, that remembrance has an audience. The contrast could not be sharper. The commune bound its people in quiet submission, while here we create a community through speech, through acknowledgement, through the simple act of answering. The placement of this request is deliberate. It comes at the point when the pattern of deaths is undeniable, when unease has sharpened into horror. Just as the survivors once faced the decision to keep quiet or risk speaking, you too are offered a choice: remain passive or participate in ensuring that this story, and others like it, are carried forward. Unlike them, you face no punishment for answering. Your voice is free, and in that freedom lies the antidote to what the commune imposed. So while we prepare to move deeper into the record toward the investigator's arrival, the artifacts he left, and the confrontation that finally shattered the commune's secrecy, pause for a moment. Add your voice to the living record. Tell us where you are, who you are, and why you listen. Each response joins a chorus that the River Commune never allowed. A chorus that proves silence, no matter how long it is enforced, can never remain absolute. By the spring of 1974, an outsider finally entered the story with enough persistence to leave a record of what he saw. His name was Dr. Ellery Vaughn, a physician contracted by the state to monitor rural health programs. He was not a sheriff nor a preacher, nor a journalist. His mandate was simple: to chart patterns of disease and malnutrition in isolated communities. Yet in that simplicity lay his authority, and his arrival at the River Commune was the first true challenge to the walls of silence that Harn had built. Vaughn approached not as an enemy but as a man, trained to ask questions. The body could not help but answer. The doctor's notes, preserved in his field journal, are striking in their precision. He describes children with wasting frames, enlarged eyes, and evidence of prolonged dietary insufficiency. He remarks on the near total absence of speech among them, not only in his presence but among themselves, as though silence had been drilled into their reflexes. In the adults, he recorded marked pallor, signs of untreated infection, and a reluctance to meet the examiner's gaze. He wrote, "Community presents uniform decline, inconsistent with environment, suggests imposed regimen rather than natural scarcity." In other words, the suffering he observed could not be explained by poverty alone. It was systemic, intentional. The contrast could not be starker. The commune claimed purity, wellness, and divine discipline, while Vaughn's medical eye saw malnutrition, pathology, and coercion. What Harn framed as sacrifice, the doctor recorded as abuse. Vaughn noted in one passage that when he attempted to question the leader directly, Harn responded not with anger but with pious detachment. The body is a vessel for the spirit, and we do not serve the flesh. To Vaughn, this was no theology. It was a refusal to justify conditions plainly evident in the bones and skin of his followers. But the most disturbing part of Vaughn's notes were the absences.
He tallied the number of children presented
to him and compared them against the census list he had been given by the county 2 years earlier. The numbers did not match. By his calculation, at least 7 children were unaccounted for. When he asked about them, Harn's answer was vague. Some had returned to the Lord, others had gone with their parents. Yet no graves were marked, no departures documented. Vaughn underlined the discrepancy in his journal 3 times, a small act of defiance that later became crucial evidence. The artifact of his journal is both intimate and damning, written in the clipped language of a physician. It carries none of the hysteria of rumor, none of the resignation of townsfolk gossip. Instead, it lays out facts: height, weight, pulse, diagnosis. Yet between the clinical lines, one feels his growing unease. In the margins, he scribbled questions. Where are the missing? Why nocturnal burials? Why silence enforced? As if he knew he was scratching at the edges of something larger than his assignment. Vaughn's visit ended abruptly. After less than a week, he was informed by county supervisors that his services in that region were no longer required. No explanation was given, though whispers later suggested that pressure from the commune's allies had played a part. His journal, however, remained. Though shelved in a health department archive and forgotten for years, it eventually surfaced in later investigations. It was the first artifact to pierce the commune's facade with objective detail. In that record, we see the clash of 2 worldviews: science against creed, evidence against secrecy, the doctor's insistence on speaking, what he observed against Harn's command to erase through silence. The people of the commune may have endured in quiet, but the body does not lie, and Vaughn's ink preserved what their voices could not. Dr. Vaughn's journal might have ended as a forgotten curiosity in the state's archives were it not for the packet of correspondence that accompanied it, bound with a thin ribbon and marked confidential. The letters were drafts never sent, written in Vaughn's own hand, but left behind among his papers after his sudden removal from the case. They read less like formal reports and more like private appeals, a man trying to convince himself as much as the officials he hoped to reach. In one draft to the Department of Public Health, he wrote, "The commune on the river presents not as a religious colony but as an experiment in deprivation. Children are not simply hungry, they are groomed into silence. I suspect deliberate withholding of food as discipline. The phrasing is cautious, the tone restrained, but the implication is devastating." Another draft intended for a colleague in the state university takes on a more desperate tone. Vaughn confesses to sleepless nights after his visit, haunted by the hollow faces of children who would not meet his eye. He admits to feeling watched during his examinations, with Harn or one of his elders hovering just close enough to intimidate. At one point he writes, "I felt less a doctor than an intruder at a burial ground. Their silence is not reverence, it is terror, cultivated and absolute." The letter ends without signature, as though he abandoned it mid-thought, unsure whether sending it would place him in danger. Among these papers was also a list, names, ages, and notations of height and weight. At first glance, it resembles a standard medical chart, but closer inspection reveals gaps. Several children's names are crossed out, with no explanation. Next to one, Vaughn had scrawled only a question mark. The chilling absence of clarity transforms the list into something more than data. It is a ledger of the missing, a silent roll call of lives erased without record. This artifact, mundane in form, carries the weight of accusation. It is proof that Vaughn noticed what others refused to acknowledge, that the commune's numbers did not add up. That night after night, someone was disappearing. These documents introduce a new contrast, evidence versus suppression. Vaughn gathered proof, preserved in ink and careful observation, yet his work was boxed away, sidelined by officials who deemed it inconvenient. The community outside the river may have whispered rumors, but here was a trained physician putting those suspicions into the language of fact. Still no inquiry followed. No arrests were made. The silence of the commune found its twin in the silence of the bureaucracy. When the drafts finally surfaced decades later, investigators and journalists would marvel at their precision. Yet at the time they were discarded, folded into forgotten files, their warnings unheard. The voices of the children remained muted, and their absence continued to be explained away by Harn's cryptic assurances. In the contrast between Vaughn's ink and the county's neglect lies the true horror. Not only were the commune's victims buried in darkness, but the truth about them was buried as well, sealed in cabinets left to yellow and fade. The letters, the list, the unsent reports, together they form a kind of chorus, though composed of one man's pen. They speak to us across time, insisting that the bodies were real, that the silences were enforced, that the lantern lights by the river were no illusion. In them we glimpse both the bravery of documentation and the futility of it when institutions choose to look away. They remind us that proof alone is never enough. Someone must be willing to act upon it, and in the case of the River Commune, action never came. By the late summer of 1974, what had once been rumor and suspicion was finally forced into confrontation. A young woman named Clara Jennings, who had entered the commune with her parents at the age of 15, escaped one humid August night by swimming across the river under moonlight. Exhausted and half delirious, she staggered into town with her hands torn and her voice hoarse from disuse. Her arrival set into motion the first real challenge to Harn's dominion. For Clara carried not only her own testimony but something tangible. A folded scrap of paper she had hidden against her skin, damp with river water, covered in neat rows of names. It was, she whispered, a burial ledger. The artifact was crude but unmistakable. Written in Harn's careful script, it listed dates alongside first names, each followed by a single mark, sometimes a cross, sometimes only a dash. Clara told officials it had been kept in the meeting house, locked in a chest. She had stolen a fragment when sent to sweep the room, tearing it along the fold so it would fit in the hem of her dress. She risked death for that scrap, she said, because without it no one would ever believe what had happened in the dark hours by the river. The paper, faintly smeared from her wet flight, still bore the indentation of Harn's hand. Clara's testimony was halting at first. Years of enforced silence left her unsure how to shape words, but gradually, in a whispered voice, she described the nights when lanterns gathered at the water's edge, when children who had been sick or merely disobedient were carried away and never returned. She told of the command to eat in stillness, bury in silence, the mantra repeated whenever anyone dared to ask questions. She confessed her terror that she, too, would be placed in the ground for daring to doubt. The contrast in her story was wrenching. The innocence of a girl raised among hymns and river breezes, twisted into complicity by fear, and finally broken into desperate courage. For the townspeople, Clara's arrival was electric. Some saw in her proof of what they had long suspected. Others accused her of blasphemy, of turning against her own family. The sheriff's deputies, already inclined to wash their hands of the commune, dismissed her as unstable. Yet Vaughn's earlier notes, still lingering in the county archive, gave her story weight. Where his charts had tallied absences, Clara's fragment filled the void with names. Together they formed a chain too heavy to ignore. This is the moment where the story tilts, where silence meets its first real fracture. Clara's stolen ledger transformed the whispers of the community into something undeniable. For the first time, the deaths had documentation beyond rumor, testimony beyond speculation. And yet even then the machinery of authority hesitated. Officials feared charges they could not sustain, feared meddling with religion, feared backlash more than they feared the truth. Clara was sheltered by a sympathetic minister, her scrap of paper placed in a safe, while meetings were held and delayed, letters written and filed. The confrontation, then, was not a single clash but a slow grind of competing forces. A survivor's desperate voice against the inertia of institutions, one scrap of paper against the heavy silence of sealed logbooks. In the end, Clara's escape revealed the deepest contrast of all, the difference between what people knew in their hearts and what they were willing to admit aloud. She had swum through darkness to deliver her proof, but whether it would be enough to shatter the commune's walls remained uncertain. For now, the artifact lay in official hands, fragile and water-stained, yet carrying within it the weight of unmarked graves and voices never heard. The raid, when it finally came, unfolded not as a decisive strike of law against secrecy, but as a faltering, almost reluctant act. In October of 1974, spurred by mounting public pressure and Clara Jennings' testimony, county officials authorized deputies to enter the River Commune for inspection of welfare and safety. The language of the order was telling, softened, bureaucratic, as though even in this moment the authorities wished to avoid admitting what they feared to find. Yet once the deputies crossed the river and stepped onto the damp soil of the settlement, hesitation gave way to an eerie confrontation with the reality of life inside. Accounts differ on what they saw first. Some describe the rows of cabins, their shutters drawn tight, smoke rising weakly from chimneys though no sound issued from within. Others recalled the strange stillness of the people, who stood in silent lines as if rehearsed for this very intrusion. Harn emerged last, walking slowly from the meeting house with a worn Bible pressed to his chest. He spoke softly, assuring the deputies that his flock was in good health, that their ways were peaceful, that the girl who had fled was confused. His calm was deliberate, almost theatrical, meant to contrast the suspicion swirling around him. Yet behind him, deputies reported seeing children with hollow cheeks and bare feet, their eyes darting nervously but their mouths unmoving. The tension peaked when one deputy, breaking from protocol, pushed open the door of the meeting house. Inside, stacked neatly along the wall, were shovels still crusted with soil, lanterns blackened from recent use, and wooden boards that looked suspiciously like crude grave markers stripped of inscriptions. No bodies were found, no freshly turned earth within the commune's boundary, but the implements of burial, clustered together in that dim room, whispered of nocturnal labor by the riverbank. The deputies withdrew, shaken yet unsure whether they had grounds to act further. Tools, after all, are not corpses. Witnesses say the atmosphere grew charged in that moment. The followers shifted uneasily, sensing the possibility of collapse. Some clutched their children tighter, others averted their eyes. Harn alone seemed unbothered. He lifted his hand and reminded the deputies of the sheriff's earlier findings, of the logbooks that had declared no foul play, of the constitutional right to religious practice. His words, measured and precise, wrapped the silence of his people in the language of law. The contrast was unbearable. Evidence of death and fear on one side, the shield of rights and bureaucracy on the other. The confrontation ended not with arrests but with retreat. Deputies withdrew under orders to avoid escalation, leaving behind only notes and photographs of the tools. Harn returned to his people, who received him with bowed heads. For the commune, the raid became proof of their inviolability. For Clara, watching from the safety of the minister's home across the river, it was devastation, proof that even when confronted, the system lacked the courage to act. The raid's failure etched itself into the story as a turning point. It showed that secrecy could endure even under scrutiny, that the silence of the commune was reinforced by the silence of the institutions meant to protect. No graves were exhumed, no names restored, no missing accounted for. Instead, the riverbank remained untouched, its soil undisturbed, while the lanterns at night resumed their quiet glow. The confrontation had come, But its result was only confirmation. The commune could bury not just its dead, but the truth itself. In the aftermath of the failed raid, the commune seemed to draw in upon itself like a wounded animal, retreating further into the shell of its rituals. Outsiders saw less and less of the settlers, where once they came into town for salt, tools, or medicine. Now they made no purchases at all. They grew insular, drawing sustenance only from the river and their gardens, as though contact itself had become a contaminant. At night the lanterns still appeared along the bank, but more sporadically, as if burials had been pushed deeper into secrecy. Silence, once a discipline, became a weapon, an armor that no deputy, no doctor, no survivor's testimony could pierce. Yet that silence carried a cost, and it showed in the people themselves. Survivors later remembered the atmosphere of dread that settled like fog after the raid. Children, already subdued, became spectral, thin shadows who walked in lines, never playing, never laughing. Parents whispered less, fearing that any word of dissent might be overheard and punished. Even those most loyal to Harn seemed haunted, their faith edged with desperation. To them, the raid was not proof of weakness but of siege. They had survived intrusion, yes, but at the price of tightening their own chains. The wider world, meanwhile, moved on. In the sheriff's logbooks, the event was recorded as inspection, no irregularities found. In newspapers, Clara's story was mentioned briefly, then relegated to the margins as other scandals filled the front page. The doctor who had first raised questions, Vaughn, was never called back. His reports gathered dust while the county congratulated itself on avoiding a confrontation that might have led to needless controversy. In night, that contrast, the widening indifference of the outside world against the deepening isolation of the commune, lies the cruelest irony. The more desperate the situation inside became, the less attention it drew from beyond the river. For the followers, silence was no longer just commanded. It became their only means of survival. To speak of hunger was to risk punishment. To speak of the missing was to risk disappearance. To speak of doubt was to mark oneself for the graves dug by lantern light. What began as a spiritual discipline had become an unspoken contract: stay quiet, or be swallowed by the soil. Some obeyed out of faith, others out of terror, but all lived under the same weight. Their world shrank to the edges of the riverbank, hemmed in by silence on both sides, imposed silence within, neglectful silence without. Artifacts from this period are scarce. A few scraps of children's drawings, later found hidden under floorboards, show crude shapes of lanterns, stick figures with shovels, and blackened circles that may have represented the river at night. They are not official records, but they speak in the language of fear children could not otherwise express. Against the backdrop of official denials and fading headlines, these small sketches remind us of the human cost carried within the walls of silence. Thus, the aftermath of the raid hardened the pattern rather than breaking it. The commune did not dissolve. It doubled down. The state did not intervene. It retreated further. And caught between these two silences, the victims continued to vanish. The contrast, stark and inescapable, is this. While the lanterns burned less brightly on the riverbank, the graves they marked did not cease. They merely grew harder to see. By the winter of 1975, the story of the River Commune might have dissolved entirely, into rumor had it not been for a discovery made far from the settlement itself. A group of county workers, clearing brush along a stretch of floodplain several miles downstream, unearthed a patch of disturbed soil, expecting to find little more than the carcass of an animal. They uncovered instead the edge of a wooden box. The box rotted and collapsed, contained fragments of cloth, and the brittle remains of bone too, small to belong to an adult. Though no official excavation followed, the workers' quiet whispers spread through the town. The river was giving up what the commune had buried in darkness. News of the find reignited long-dormant suspicions. The artifact, a handful of splintered boards, scraps of fabric patterned with faded stars, and a lock of hair preserved in the damp earth, was collected quietly, sealed in a paper sack, and logged without ceremony. The sheriff's office marked it as unverified remains, likely animal, but those who had seen it knew otherwise. One laborer, speaking years later, said he could not forget the tiny bones like bird bones, but shaped for hands. The official record dismissed the find, but memory preserved what the paper refused to name. This moment deepened the contrast that had defined the commune's legacy. Revelation against denial. Evidence against obfuscation. The earth itself speaking when the authorities would not. The burial had not been within the commune's borders, perhaps carried by floodwaters or perhaps intentionally placed farther afield. Either way, it tied the secrecy of the night burials to the physical reality of death. Where the sheriff's logbooks had erased, the soil testified. Where Harn's sermons had demanded silence, the ground whispered truth. Inside the commune, news of the discovery brought fear. Survivors recall that Harn delivered a sermon in which he declared, "The earth is treacherous. It betrays the faithful." He warned his followers that outsiders would use lying soil to condemn them, and he commanded even stricter isolation. Children were no longer permitted near the riverbanks unsupervised, and elders patrolled at night to guard against intrusion. The river, once their lifeline, became a source of suspicion. In their effort to hide the dead, they had given the land a voice that could not be silenced. The artifact itself, the cloth, the wood, the bones, disappeared into storage, mislabeled and ignored. Only fragments of description survive, passed between those who glimpsed it before it vanished into county archives. Yet its symbolic weight remains immense. It stands as the first material proof, however faint, that the commune's silence was not simply ritual but concealment of death. It revealed the brutal contrast at the heart of the case. The state could deny, leaders could preach, witnesses could falter, but the body, reduced to fragments though it was, could not be wished away. This discovery marked the beginning of the end for the commune's invisibility. Though officials still hesitated, and though no immediate action was taken, the story began to shift. No longer was it merely about rumor or testimony. There was now matter, soil, cloth, bone that refused to vanish. From this point forward, the silence that had once shielded the River Commune would face its greatest enemy, the persistence of the physical world, which remembers what the living would prefer to forget. The discovery downstream did not dissolve the commune. Instead, it drove Harn and his followers into a kind of siege posture, as though the very air outside their borders carried accusation. Survivors would later describe this period as one of absolute control, when every action was measured against the risk of exposure. Lanterns still flickered by the river at night, but now they were guarded by watchmen. Graves were dug farther from the settlement, often in the dense woods where discovery was less likely. Inside the commune, discipline hardened into fear. Meals were shorter, punishments harsher, and the demand for silence became suffocating. What had begun as a spiritual practice of restraint now functioned as a cage, and yet cracks appeared. A few followers, once unquestioning, began to falter under the weight of what they had witnessed. One woman, known later only as Ruth, slipped notes beneath floorboards, tiny scraps of paper with scrawled words like "count," "missing," and "ask where." Another man began keeping a hidden tally on the handle of his shovel, scratching notches for each burial he had attended. These makeshift artifacts, fragments of private defiance, reveal how even in the depths of repression, memory resisted erasure. They were not cries for help so much as records for the future, proof that someone had noticed, that someone had refused to let the numbers vanish entirely. Outside the commune, however, silence reigned just as strongly. Officials downplayed the unearthed remains, dismissing them as inconclusive. The sheriff's office, having been embarrassed once, now refused to reopen inquiries without direct orders from the state. Townspeople, weary of scandal, chose willful ignorance. They did not want to admit that death was unfolding so near their homes, so they chose to believe the official line. The contrast grew sharper. Inside the commune, silence was enforced with threat. Outside, it was chosen with convenience. Together, the two silences formed an almost impenetrable barrier. Within this sealed world, the psychological cost was immense. Survivors remember nights of insomnia, when the sound of a spade striking earth carried across the dark and into their dreams. They recall the way children learned to read lips, since speaking aloud was so rare, and how even laughter became suspect. Faith and fear blurred until it was difficult to distinguish. Loyalty to Harn from terror of him. Some followed sincerely, believing the burials were acts of purification. Others followed because they had seen what happened to those who resisted. In both cases, silence bound them. By 1976, the commune existed in a state of perpetual dread. The confrontation with deputies had proven that the outside world would not save them, and the discovery downstream proved that the earth itself might betray them. They were trapped between exposure and denial, between loyalty to a leader and longing for release. This tension was unsustainable, and it set the stage for what came next, the unraveling. For the moment, though, the commune endured in its terrible balance. A community that lived by day in rigid quiet and dug by night in greater secrecy, clinging to a silence that was at once their shield and their sentence. The unraveling began not with a dramatic revolt, but with exhaustion. By 1977, the commune's numbers had dwindled. Children continued to disappear. Adults succumbed to illness, and defections, though rare, chipped at the facade of unity. Harn, once a commanding figure whose calm voice held sway over dozens, grew visibly thinner, his sermons tinged with desperation. Survivors describe him pacing the meeting house, insisting that trials proved their chosenness, that each burial brought them closer to transcendence. Yet even as he spoke, his flock looked away, their eyes dulled by hunger and grief. The silence that had once signified obedience now resembled apathy. It was in this fragile atmosphere that confrontation returned, not from deputies or doctors, but from within. One evening, during a meal of boiled roots, a young father broke the enforced quiet and asked aloud, "Where is my son?" His voice shattered the stillness like a stone through glass. Witnesses recall the audible gasp, the clatter of spoons dropped against bowls. For the first time in years, words other than prayer or command echoed in the hall. Harn responded not with comfort but with fury, striking the man and declaring him corrupted by doubt. Yet the damage was done. Silence had been broken from within, and the spell of fear began to fracture. Rumors of departure spread quickly. Some whispered of crossing the river under cover of night. Others of appealing once more to the authorities. But leaving was not simple. Guards patrolled the edges, and punishment for disobedience was swift. Still, the desire grew, feeding on the cracks in Harn's authority. Survivors remember watching him more closely, noting his fatigue, his reliance on scripture to mask the absence of real answers. The contrast was stark. A leader once revered as unshakable, now revealed as a faltering man, his power waning even as his punishments grew harsher. During this period, new artifacts emerged. A torn hymn book was discovered with its margins filled by a child's hand. Words scratched in charcoal. "I am still here." Another follower smuggled a page from the burial ledger, hidden in the lining of a coat, which bore names crossed out with almost ritualistic precision. These fragments, fragile and dangerous to keep, were carried beyond the river by those who escaped. In them we see a people beginning to reclaim voice, to counter silence with testimony, even if only in scraps. Meanwhile, whispers reached town again, this time more insistent. Traders spoke of seeing thin figures lurking by the tree line, of hearing weeping carried across the water. Some claimed to glimpse abandoned cabins, shutters banging in the wind. The commune, once tightly sealed, was fraying at its edges. The contrast between its image of rigid order and the reality of internal collapse became increasingly difficult to ignore. By the end of 1977, the commune was a hollow echo of itself. Followers still ate in silence, still buried at night, but the cohesion that had once bound them was gone. Fear persisted, but faith had thinned. The inevitable confrontation loomed, not a raid from without, but a collapse from within. And when it came, it would not be orderly or quiet. It would be a desperate, chaotic unraveling of a silence that could no longer hold. The collapse, when it finally arrived in the spring of 1978, was less an explosion than a series of cascading breaches, each feeding the next until silence could no longer contain the weight of all that had been buried. It began with another disappearance, this time not of a child, but of an elder named Thomas Hale, Miriam's brother, who had remained loyal even after her death. When Thomas failed to appear at morning prayers, whispers spread quickly through the cabins. Some said he had fallen ill, others that he had questioned Harn in private. What was certain was that he did not return, and no burial lanterns were seen that night. For many, this was the breaking point. If even elders vanished without explanation, then no one was safe. Fear turned inward. Families began to distrust one another, suspecting spies among their neighbors. Mothers smuggled scraps of food to hide for their children, a quiet act of rebellion against the controlled rations. Men who once guarded the river began to falter, their loyalty eroded by exhaustion and doubt. Harn sensed this unraveling, and his sermons grew darker, laced with threats rather than promises. Survivors recall him standing before the congregation, declaring that betrayal had entered. their midst, and that the only path forward was absolute obedience. Yet his voice cracked with strain, betraying the weakness of a man who felt his grip slipping. The confrontation came one night when a group of families attempted to leave together. They had prepared for weeks, hoarding bits of dried food, gathering courage. But as they made for the riverbank, guards intercepted them. A struggle broke out, shouts, the first in years to shatter the commune's nocturnal stillness. Some managed to dive into the water, their bodies vanishing into the current. Others were dragged back, beaten and displayed the next morning as examples. That night marked the first true rebellion within the commune, and though it was crushed, it proved that silence could be broken not only by whispers but by open defiance. Artifacts from this night would later surface in scattered forms. A deputy's report mentions finding clothing snagged on a branch downstream, fabric torn as if from a desperate flight. Another account describes a page ripped from Harn's Bible, discovered in a cabin after the commune was finally abandoned. Scrawled across the scripture in shaky handwriting were the words, "We could not stay." These fragments, ordinary in themselves, bear witness to the fact that rebellion, though punished, was real. The silence had not been total. The contrast of this period is striking. The commune outwardly still projected discipline, meals in order, prayers conducted, fields tended, but within, the fear had curdled into mistrust, and obedience into despair. The very rituals meant to preserve unity now revealed fracture. Where once the silence had been an unbroken wall, it was now riddled with cracks through which desperation leaked. By the summer of that year, numbers had dwindled to less than half of what they had been at the commune's peak. Children were gone, families broken, elders vanished. The riverbank, once alive with whispered burials, grew strangely quiet, as though even the ground had tired of receiving its dead. And in that quiet, different from the silence enforced by Harn, lay the truth. The commune was collapsing not from outside pressure, but from the impossibility of sustaining a life built on fear, secrecy, and graves dug in darkness. When the commune finally dissolved, it left behind no triumphant rescue, no single event to close the story cleanly. Instead, it disintegrated slowly, leaving cabins abandoned with doors swinging open, pots still on stoves, and hymnals strewn across pews as if dropped mid-prayer. By the time authorities returned in 1979, the river settlement was nearly empty. A handful of gaunt survivors lingered, unwilling or unable to leave, their voices brittle from years of silence. The rest had scattered, some drowned in the attempt to escape, others vanishing into nearby towns, their pasts cloaked in shame. Harn himself was never conclusively found. Stories diverge between his death in the woods, his capture under another name, or his disappearance into the currents of the river he had made sacred. The absence of closure only deepened the sense of unease. The aftermath was marked by suppression rather than investigation. State records sealed reports, under the pretense of insufficient evidence, and local officials discouraged public discussion. It was easier, perhaps, for the community at large to forget than to confront what had festered so close to their own lives. Families who had lost relatives were left with unanswered questions, their grief denied legitimacy by the silence of bureaucracy. The only traces that remained were the artifacts smuggled out. A child's hymn book with defiant words in the margins, a ledger with names struck through, a fragment of a Bible page declaring, "We could not stay." These fragments, fragile as they are, became the only counterweight to official erasure. What lingers most powerfully is not only the horror of what happened, but the paradox of how it endured. Silence had been both shield and weapon. It protected the commune from scrutiny while simultaneously suffocating its members. Faith had blurred into control, sanctuary into captivity, devotion into fear. The river itself, once a symbol of life and sustenance, became an accomplice, carrying away traces of the buried and swallowing the cries of those who tried to flee. In the contrast between what the commune promised, purity, transcendence, belonging, and what it delivered, loss, erasure, and graves, lies the moral weight of the story. And yet survivors remind us of something beyond horror. They speak of small acts of defiance, the whispered question, the smuggled note, the tally carved into a shovel handle. These were not enough to stop the collapse, but they were enough to prove that silence was never absolute. Even in the darkest periods, there were voices that refused to vanish. Their fragments now invite us to ask not only what happened, but what it means. The ethical demand of this history is clear. Stories like these cannot be left to erasure. They must be told with care, with empathy for the victims, and with acknowledgement of how institutions failed to protect them. What does it mean that entire lives can vanish in plain sight, ignored because they were inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unbelievable? And what responsibility do we carry as listeners in refusing to turn away? As we close this account, the question remains for you. If silence allowed such things to endure once, what silences exist around us now, buried not in riverside soil, but in our own unwillingness to confront what is too troubling to face?